Welcome to Session 2 of How Do We Get the Bible? The Credibility of the Scriptures. In this session, and the one to follow, we'll look at the evidence for the historical authenticity, reliability, and credibility of the Old Testament. Because there's such a vast amount of evidence, we'll limit ourselves to the high points, and we'll break this session into two parts. As we noted in Session 1, in spite of being written by so many writers over such a great span of time, when we zoom out for a wide-angle view of the documents that make up the Bible, they look like pieces of a huge quilt, which together lay out a great epic story. It begins with God's creation of the world, and it ends with the judgment and His creation of a new heavens and a new earth. And the fabric of the story is not composed of myths and legends like Aesop's fables that were made up to illustrate spiritual ideas. The Bible captures the real places, events, and individuals who were given messages from God, people who had seen Him steer the course of human history, challenge and rescue individuals, raise up kings, or deliver the people of Israel through catastrophic natural forces. Instead of the muted blurriness of an impressionistic painting, the Bible is more like the crisp reality of a high-resolution digital photograph. And this reality factor, if you will, jars us as readers because it brings us face to face with a living God. So to prepare for our journey through the Old Testament, let's begin with a simple timeline of that era. Since we're looking at the BC side of history, you can see how the values get larger as we go to the left from the year 0 further back in time. The Bible puts the creation back here, followed by Adam and Eve, then Noah about here, and Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, here. Abraham is followed by his son Isaac, and then his grandson Jacob, who with his 12 sons migrates to Egypt. Over the next 430 years, Jacob's family multiplies to become the 12 tribes of Israel, the people who end up as slaves to the Egyptians. About here, Moses is chosen to lead the descendants of Jacob out of Egypt, and then his successor Joshua helps them take and subdue the land of Palestine. After several hundred years under leaders called judges, the tribes of Israel become an actual kingdom here, about 1050 BC, with Saul its first king. Saul is succeeded by David and then his son Solomon, and then the kingdom splits into northern and southern halves. The northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and then the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians 136 years later in 586 or 7 BC. After 70 years of captivity, a small remnant of the nation returns to Palestine and painstakingly rebuilds the city walls of Jerusalem and then the temple itself. So if the Bible contains a record of a series of real-world events that took place over time, how did the idea that it is just a book of myths and legends become so widespread? One reason is that there are Old Testament scholars who embrace and promote a personal philosophy and view of reality that are contradictory to the biblical record. This means that they must either alter their own basic approach to life or reject the Bible's message and attack its credibility. These are the people who assert things like, the Bible is not anyone's history, the nation of Israel was made up between 538 and 165 BC. The early kings of Israel in the Bible, like Saul and King David and Solomon, are just fictional, legendary characters, not real people. To explain away the biblical record, these antagonists have promoted the idea that some hypothetical, later Jewish writers must have invented their own national history and then projected it into the ancient past. We say hypothetical because no one has ever found any documents written by these imaginary later Jews, nor any mention even of their names. They are just speculations from the Bible's detractors. The Bible's critics were almost beside themselves with anticipation when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, but when they were fully released, translated, and published, there were no writings that supported the Bible detractors' theories. But what if the actual hard evidence points in the opposite direction? What if we were to turn up a pendant, which was once worn on the necklace of the notorious biblical queen Jezebel, or a clay seal that was used by one of the kings of Judah to secure one of his royal documents, or the actual fingerprint of Baruch the scribe who wrote down our book of Jeremiah? What if we found a stone monument made by a pagan king to celebrate his victory over one of King David's great-grandsons? Or what if we uncovered the city gates designed and built by the engineers of King Solomon, or a fortress city that was actually built by King David himself? Would we still think of these folks as fictional characters, or would we begin to see them as real people and the biblical account as credible? Rather than letting some unknown experts with their own hidden agendas and unspoken presuppositions tell us what to believe, let's examine for ourselves the actual places and objects that have bearing on the authenticity of the Old Testament scriptures. In the process, we'll see how time after time this hard evidence overthrows the speculative theories of the biblical rejectionists who have nevertheless had such a negative impact on modern thinking. The data we'll be using comes from ancient monuments, stone inscriptions, and archaeological excavations of ancient cities. So we'll begin with the field of archaeology itself. By archaeology, we mean the study of the human past by examination and excavation of places of human occupation, and the recovery and analysis of human artifacts and other physical remains. In our day-to-day speech, we often use the word history to mean simply what's happened in the past. But sometimes scholars in this field of study make a distinction between history and archaeology. For their purposes, they use the word history to refer to written records in contrast with archaeology, which deals with physical evidence. In our investigation, we'll be looking at both. Since our first item of evidence involves the sites of several ancient cities, we'll need some very basic information about biblical archaeology and how its data is acquired. The beginning point is usually a surface survey of various regions that make up the biblical landscape. At its broadest, a surface survey looks for signs of human occupation that are simply lying on the surface. This might include pieces of pottery, personal artifacts, ruins of ancient buildings, and so forth. Often, the surface debris is evidence of things like individual dwellings or small villages, travel routes, and so on. The distribution of this kind of evidence can tell us about population sizes and the presence of peoples and cultures in the various eras. Sometimes a surface survey will actually discover the exposed materials of more substantial buildings, including cities and fortresses like Khirbet Qeiyafa, which we'll look at later. But there's even more dramatic type of evidence that is common in the land of Israel. We're referring here to the large number of man-made, flat-topped earthen mounds that archaeologists call tells. A tell is a mound formed by layer upon layer of physical remains from successive populations that once occupied the site. Some of the smaller ones are only 4 or 5 acres in size, but one, Tel Hazer, is over 200 acres. That's large enough to hold over 150 football fields. The tells are the remains of ancient cities, many of which are mentioned in the Bible. So how were these tells formed? People initially built their city at a place that was attractive because of factors like water source, arable and pasture lands, trade routes, defensibility, strategic military position, and so forth. Eventually, the city would be attacked and destroyed or abandoned for one reason or another, but the site would still be attractive for many of the same reasons for which it was first established. So later settlers would move in, reuse the best of the remaining stones, pack down the rest of the debris, and build a new city right on top of the earlier ruins. This process created a sequence of layers, as you can see in this picture at Tel Beersheba in southern Israel. In order for the evidence embedded in a layer to have much value, we need to know when the people of that era lived. So how do we accomplish that? Over the years, archaeologists have established the dates of a significant number of elements that turn up in excavations. The construction and layout of both public buildings and private buildings, or the building materials like stone, brick, clay, or paving with dirt, stone, mosaic tile, or wall paintings and decorations. And then smaller items like jewelry, pins, brooches, writing instruments, tools, clay and oil lamps, pottery vessels, and so forth. When a given layer contains several different items and features that were all common to a particular era, we can be fairly confident about when the people occupied the layer in question. Ancient pottery is one of the primary means for dating the layers of occupations in a tell. Let's take a modern-day example to see how that works. Suppose we were excavating the foundation for a skyscraper and uncovered some empty Coke bottles in the soil that we were removing. The Coke bottle's shape and material would tell us when it was made, and from that we could determine the date of the soil in which we found it. The soil layers from the 50s wouldn't have a Coke bottle shape that hadn't been created until the 70s. Unless a layer's been disturbed, the layer cannot be older than the youngest object in it. Likewise, biblical archaeologists use aspects of the pottery's form, its material, and decoration to accomplish the same thing. They consider things like the shape and function of the item, the type of lip or rim on the vessel, the style of its handle if it had one, the color and type of clay used, slip or glaze or burnishing style of the decoration, and so forth. Here's the pot in situ, that is, in its original location. You can see the reference tag that identifies where the pottery fragment was found. Fortunately, the location of broken pottery doesn't usually change much. When a pot's broken during the destruction of a city, the next generation of builders just leave the potsherds where they fell, giving us an extremely stable, dependable time markers. So, the identification of pottery in the various strata of a tell is one of the gold standards that the archaeologist uses to date each particular layer. These factors have long been identified, cataloged, and dated from around the ancient Mediterranean world. Occasionally, the sensationalist media will report some new archaeological find and tell us that it discredits the Bible. So it's important to remember that as valuable as archaeology is, it does have its limitations. We can't simply take everything that this or that archaeologist says as beyond question. By comparison, one of the weaknesses of written historical sources is the bias of the ancient writers. They may be trying to push an agenda. But in contrast, archaeology deals with raw physical evidence, which gives the appearance of being bias-free, but it's not. With archaeology, the bias is not in the evidence, it's in the interpretation. An archaeologist interprets the evidence from within his or her own artificial, theoretical construct of the ancient world, and that is unavoidably built on their own personal ideological biases and on their personal view of reality. We've all seen movies in which police detectives arrive at completely opposite conclusions using the very same crime scene evidence. Their contradictory conclusions are the result of their different personal backgrounds, level of experience, presuppositions, levels of objectivity, and so forth. And the biblical archaeologist faces the same challenges to his or her objectivity, plus the daunting task of interpreting raw, circumstantial evidence that came from thousands of years ago in a foreign or even extinct culture. And if he or she has been influenced by anti-biblical theologians, then they will expect the Bible to be wrong, and they will interpret the evidence to fit that assumption. And like forensic investigators, sometimes honest archaeologists simply make mistakes. More than once, an apparent conflict between the archaeological evidence and the Bible ultimately turned out to be the result of wrongly identifying the city that was being excavated. And finally, we need to be aware that some very vocal archaeologists support their anti-biblical theories with the lack of evidence. Their unspoken assumption is, if we haven't found any evidence to support the Bible, then it must not be there. This reasoning is seriously flawed. An example will show us why. Tel Hazor has been excavated for over 26 seasons, making it one of the most excavated sites in all of Israel. The lead archaeologist, Amnon Ben-Tor, estimates that at their present rate of progress, it would take about 500 years to fully excavate the rest of the site. In terms of the data that's been unearthed so far, we've barely scratched the surface. And there are many other tells that have never even been touched. So an argument from silence is a very shaky foundation on which to base one's assumptions and theories. Unfortunately, that hasn't stopped the Bible's detractors. On the plus side, one of the very important benefits of archaeology for our investigation into the credibility of the scriptures is this. We gain access to evidence that's been buried and undisturbed for thousands of years, information that the later Jews themselves did not have and therefore could not have used to fabricate a fictitious history of their nation. So with an awareness of its value and limitations, let's see how biblical archaeology helps us test the historical credibility of the Bible, in this case, the Old Testament. Kenneth A. Kitchen, a famous Old Testament scholar and one of the greatest living Egyptologists, has collected a vast amount of data from the ancient world that has bearing on the antiquity and authenticity of the Old Testament text. We'll look at a few of his examples. Let's begin with the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. The implied chronology in the Bible would place their writing about 14 to 1300 BC. The Bible's detractors claim that these writings are the creation of much later Jews, likely 1,000 or more years after this time. But if we put the critics on mute for a moment and look for actual evidence, do we find anything that suggests that a person like Moses may have written them? The answer is yes. We'll begin by looking at the format of international treaties in the ancient Near East. To assess the credibility of the scriptures, like crime scene investigators, we'll look at some types of evidence that might not immediately come to mind. In this case, ancient treaties. Like governments today, the kings of the ancient Near East kept extensive royal records. They sometimes used Egyptian papyrus, but because papyrus is quite perishable, very few original papyrus documents have survived from early Old Testament times. But clay tablets were also used for the royal archives, and many of the original tablets have survived for thousands of years. In the last 150 years, archaeologists have recovered well over 100,000 clay tablets from the libraries of the various ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. Of course, translating them all is a monumental task that's still underway. But of the ones that have been translated and published, one type that we are particularly interested in is the ancient suzerainty treaty. In such a treaty, a superior king or suzerain would make a treaty with a weaker vassal king. The suzerain would promise protection for the vassal kingdom. In return, the vassal king would promise loyalty, regular monetary payments, military support during war, and so forth, sort of like the ancient version of a protection racket. So what do these ancient treaties have to do with the Bible? Actually, more than you might expect. For well over 2,000 years, biblical interpreters have recognized that the making of a covenant or agreement between two parties is an important theme in the Bible. When Moses, for example, received the 10 Commandments written on the 2 tablets of stone, he described them as the tablets of the covenant that the Lord made with Israel. In fact, the Hebrew word berith, translated here as covenant, occurs over 200 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. In the 1800s, archaeologists began unearthing and studying ancient suzerainty treaties, and then in the middle 20th century, George Mendenhall, professor in the University of Michigan's Department of Near Eastern Studies, made a landmark observation, which he published in a peer-reviewed article in 1954. Mendenhall looked at the structure of several covenants in the first 6 books of the Bible, Genesis through Joshua, and noticed that they used the same elements of form that occurred on some of the ancient clay tablets. They were not simply covenants, they were treaties. So we need to go back and have a closer look at the ancient suzerainty treaties. From the excavations at sites like Ebla, Mari, Tel Armana, Ugarit, and others, we have close to 100 ancient suzerainty treaties written in several ancient languages over a period of about 2,000 years, right within the span of the Old Testament timeline. These treaties were found in ancient royal collections and archives that have been unearthed some as recently as the last 40 years. The treaties typically include formal elements like title, prologue that describes the relationship between the 2 parties of the treaty, stipulations that laid down the specific provisions and requirements, deposit, specifying where the copies of the treaties were to be kept, witnesses, typically gods, forces of nature, or perhaps a monument, curses for violating the agreement, and finally, blessings for adhering to the treaty's terms. We can get a better understanding of the treaty structure by making a bar graph like this that shows the relative size and sequence of the treaty's various elements. Because the text mentioned various kings and historical events already known to us from other sources, scholars have been able to determine the era in which the particular treaties were written. As more and more of them were discovered and then published, dated, and translated, something fascinating came to light. Each era had its own distinct treaty format. A particular format would become established and used for a few centuries, and then another treaty structure would gain popularity and become the preferred format for another century or two. From the nearly 100 treaties that have been identified, we have a pretty clear representation of how the treaty format changed over time. Here's how they were formatted in the 3rd millennium BC. You can see how the structure changed over the span of 1,000 years. In the early part of the 2nd millennium, the treaties were structured like this. In the middle period, they were structured like this. And late in the 2nd millennium, the treaty writers used this format. And then later still, in the 1st millennium BC, the conventional treaty structure changed several more times. Since the treaty's format tells us the era in which it was written, let's apply that to the treaties that occur in the Bible. Here's the treaty format used by Jacob, a very early biblical character way back in Genesis chapter 31. Where does it fit? You can see that it's the same treaty structure that was being used right here in the 1800s BC, and that happens to be the era in which the Bible places Jacob and the treaty that he made with his father-in-law Laban. So it appears that they knew and used the treaty format that was current in their day, and that Moses preserved it when he wrote their story. This suggests that the stories and characters in the book of Genesis actually took place in the time in which the Bible places them, and that they weren't made up by some hypothetical Jews 1,500 years later. The Bible also tells us that Moses authored and appeared in the next 4 books, Exodus through Deuteronomy, and likewise his successor, Joshua. Here's the treaty format used in these books. You can see that it fits right here because it's essentially the same format that was being used around 1400 to 1200 BC. This is the very era in which the Bible places Moses, the Exodus from Egypt, and Israel's entry into the Promised Land under Joshua. Now, Deuteronomy, the last book by Moses, is a stunning case. It not only records the covenant relationship between God and the nation of Israel, but from beginning to end, the entire book itself is structured like a suzerainty treaty. It's difficult to overstate the importance of this. How are we to account for the fact that the underlying structure of the entire book of Deuteronomy is that of a 13th century BC suzerainty treaty? The critics would have us believe that the book was written here, in the 4th or even the 3rd century BC, but written in such a way that it makes us think that it was written in the 13th century. Let's test the plausibility of their theory. How could a later writer have correctly used the 13th century treaty structure to create a book of fiction? Well, first, this hypothetical writer would have to come up with the idea that there was or should be a suzerain to vassal relationship between God and the nation of Israel. Next, he would have to dream up the idea of writing a book structured like such a 13th century treaty. Then, he would have to pick the right treaty format for his imaginary character, Moses. This is not as simple as it sounds. Let's think this through. To do this hypothetical writer has to somehow get his hands on enough sample treaties to know that the format varied over time, and suzerainty treaties weren't readily available to the public. Since any given royal archive contained locally relevant treaties, which had been written over a comparatively narrow span of time, he would need to acquire a broad sample from widely separated civilizations created over several millennia so he could compare them. And in his sample, he'd have to be lucky enough to turn up and then identify some that were written in the 13th century. And even if he did this, how would he know which ones came from the time of his imaginary character Moses? As was the Egyptian custom at that time, the Egyptians were only using the king's title Pharaoh, not his individual name. Likewise, the books of the Bible don't give the names of the Pharaoh. Remember when we looked at how the tells were formed layer by layer? Well, the ancient archives with the relevant treaties had already been buried under centuries of rubble long before any 3rd century Jewish writer lived. And remember, the ancients didn't conduct archaeological excavations. That's a very recent concept and practice. So how would such a 3rd century Jewish writer have ever gotten access to any of the buried treaties to even examine? And there's no archaeological trace of this hypothetical 3rd century Jewish writer because when the archaeologists finally located the ancient royal libraries, they had lain essentially undisturbed for nearly 3,000 years. And there's yet another problem. Several of the various languages in which these treaties had been written had died out over time. So even if our hypothetical writer had gotten his hands on the right ones, he would also have to tackle the monumental task of learning the various ancient languages before he could even read them, much less use them. And after all that, he would have to figure out how to use the right treaty format as the framework for his fictional work while he intricately wove other authentic historical details into the fabric of his book. Oh, and there's one last thing. Even if this hypothetical writer could pull off this impossibly complex chain of events, why would he go to all the trouble? You see, there's no fanfare about all of this in the book of Deuteronomy. The treaty format is used so subtly in the book that no one noticed it for thousands of years until George Mendenhall's work with the ancient suzerainty treaties in 1954. The literary skill to do this stands in stark contrast to that used by known Jewish writers from the 3rd century. The writers from that era who tried to create fake histories were very clumsy and conspicuous as they tried to write their fictitious history of earlier generations. So, the probability that a 3rd century Jew could somehow patch together the book of Deuteronomy and structure it like an ancient treaty is just about zero. And all these scholars who tell us that Deuteronomy is a fake actually begin to sound like a bunch of grade schoolers playing Let's Pretend. But there is a plausible explanation for the book of Deuteronomy because we do know of a specific character in history who could have accomplished this. The Bible tells us of a Jewish infant who was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh and who then had him nurtured and raised by his Jewish birth mother. This young lad spent his first 40 years being educated in the Egyptian royal court, and we know from extra-biblical sources that the Egyptians of that time made a practice of educating young men from other cultures for royal service. That meant that he could be both familiar with his Jewish heritage and personally acquainted with the inner workings of the Egyptian government, including things like treaty formats that were being used in that day. We know this Jewish man as Moses. Moses, as he's described in the Bible, is the only known person from antiquity who had precisely the credentials, experience, and training to use the 13th century treaty format to describe the agreement between God and the people of Israel as a treaty between a suzerain and a vassal. So, far and away, the most plausible explanation is that Moses actually wrote the book of Deuteronomy just as the Bible says. So we've looked at suzerainty treaties. Let's take another of Kenneth Kitchen's examples where the biblical writers use information from their day that would not have been available to some later hypothetical Jewish writer. We'll use the price of slaves in the ancient Old Testament world. Let's make a chart going back in time and then put the prices in silver shekels on the vertical axis. In today's pricing, a silver shekel would be worth about $7.27. So about 2200 BC, the Akkadian civilization valued a slave at about 12 shekels. That was the same price in ancient Ur about 2100 BC. When we get to the Old Babylonian period, the price has risen to 20 shekels. Later in the Nuzi and Ugarit period, a slave is going for 30 shekels. By the time the Assyrian kingdom, the price of a slave has reached 50 shekels. And finally, there's a big jump in the period of the Persian period, where a slave would cost you about 115 shekels, or about $850. You can see from this chart that we have a pretty constant price increase for slaves over the span of about 1,500 years, and then a big jump. So now, let's look at the price of slaves where the biblical writers happen to mention it. Our first example is way back in the book of Genesis about 1600 BC, where the sons of Jacob sold their brother Joseph as a slave bound for Egypt. the slave traders paid them 20 shekels of silver. The next slave price mentioned in the Bible comes from about 1400 BC, when the accepted cost for replacing a slave was 30 shekels of silver, or about $218. The final passage is 2 Kings 15:20. Instead of carrying off the Israelites as slaves, the king of Syria accepted a redemption price of 50 shekels per man. Let's draw a curve for the slave prices from the ancient pagan sources. And now we'll draw one for the slave prices that are incidentally mentioned in the Old Testament books. Almost a perfect match. How do we explain that? The extra-biblical pagan sources for this information lay buried for thousands of years until the archaeologists first began to unearth it in the 1800s. So how could later Jewish writers, thousands of years later, have gotten the slave prices right? And keep in mind, this goes way back to the early stories in the Bible that are attributed to Moses. These prices were not made up by later hypothetical Jewish writers. The obvious explanation is that the various biblical writers were simply using the prices of slaves as they knew it in their own day. Incidental evidence like this tells us that the biblical documents are authentic because they reflect the real-world situation, in this case the price of slaves, from the time and place when the Bible suggests that they were written. And the passages that contain this information are in different books of the Bible from different eras, and they don't point out the slave prices to make their writing sound authentic, they just mention them. So most readers would never even notice. So far we've looked at archaeology and ancient treaties and the rising price of slaves over the centuries. Now let's ask a question or two about the motive of the writers. Why write at all? We have seen that when Jeremiah the prophet was banned from preaching in the temple in Jerusalem, God had him write down the messages that he had preached and then have his scribe Baruch read them aloud in the temple. And similarly, the New Testament writers write their books to be read aloud in the Christian gatherings. But underlying practices like this, there's the primary aim to preserve the content unchanged for future generations. For example, Isaiah is told, "Now go write it before them on a tablet and inscribe it in a book, that it may be for the time to come, as a witness forever." And in the book of Psalms, we see the same practice and purpose. "Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord." Near the end of his life, God tells Moses, "Now therefore write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. For I know what they are inclined to do even today, before I have brought them into the land that I swore to give." So Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the people of Israel. The mantra that biblical critics have persuaded people to mindlessly repeat is that the content of the Bible was written down after many centuries of word-of-mouth tradition. They want us to believe it was passed on orally, so they can assert that it has been fundamentally changed from the original story. But this theory is the exact opposite of what the evidence actually shows. In this example, the people learn the song of Moses so that it is with them day by day. A song taught to the people would be a prime candidate for oral tradition that could be tampered with, but Moses is told to write it down. This passage makes it crystal clear that the song was preserved in writing on the very day it was given, not after years and years of oral tradition. This is tremendously important. The various cultures in the ancient Near East all had prophets for their own gods, and from Mari in Mesopotamia, clear around the Fertile Crescent all the way down to Egypt, the surviving documents plainly show that the standard practice was to have a trained scribe transcribe the words of a prophet without any delay, and then deliver the tablets to the appropriate authority, usually the king. In one case, a prophet demanded that his message be transcribed only by the best available scribe. And in the book of Isaiah, the prophet is even required to have reliable witnesses to the transcribing of his message. The ancient kings wanted prophecies accurately transcribed and stored so that in the future they could verify which prophet's messages they could trust. The idea that there were years of malleable oral transmission of prophetic messages before they were written down is simply a fiction created by modern scholars. So where did the biblical writers get the stuff they wrote down? Obviously, in passages that we've already cited, God directly told them what to write. But that was not always the case. Let's look at some examples. First, we have Old Testament books by individuals who describe people and events from their own lifetimes. These include books like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Ezra, Nehemiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Quite a list. Some of these, like Nehemiah, were written autobiographically, but others, like Ezra, were written as a third-person narrative. A few of these books, like Joel, Obadiah, and Malachi, are simply a collection of the prophets' sermons, and they are void of any datable, verifiable historical information. But most of the prophetic books have anchored their message in history by providing at least some factual information about the prophet's own lifetime. The main focus of these books is the message that was directly given to a prophet to warn or encourage the people of his day, and to proclaim what God was going to bring about in the future. But there are books that cover far more than a single lifespan. A careful reader may notice that some of these books, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, cover far more years than a single person's life. So what about them? How could they cover such long spans of time? Over the centuries, well-meaning believers have blindly asserted that God must have dictated these past events to later people to have them written down. But this idea comes from not paying attention to the clues within the books themselves. The biblical writers never say that some angel came and dictated to them what to write about things that happened in the past. Instead, these writers know about events that took place before their own lifetime because they used earlier, authentic official records, and they come right out and say so. In the book of Joshua, for example, we read, "And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Joshua?" The writer's confirmation of this event is the book of Joshua, but there is no book of Joshua in the Bible itself. Again, in our book of 1 Kings we read, "Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon?" The writer implies that he used some information from the book of the Acts of Solomon, and that a great deal of additional information is available in that document. And here again, the reference is to an earlier book which is itself not in the Bible. In various places, the Bible makes it clear that these books are not purely human productions, but that the writers were guided by the Spirit of God, in this case, as they used earlier records for their facts. Here are a few more examples. Joshua and 2 Samuel mention the book of Joshua. 1 Kings references the Acts of Solomon and the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and Judah 44 different times. 1 Chronicles mentions the Chronicles of Gad the seer. 2 Chronicles tells us of 8 different earlier records that were used. The book of the Kings of Israel, history of Nathan the prophet, the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, visions of Iddo the seer, the Chronicles of Shemaiah the prophet, the commentary on the book of Kings, the Chronicles of the seers, and the laments, presumably of Jeremiah. So even when they were not eyewitnesses, the writers of the Bible's books of history did not just make things up. They carefully gleaned their information from earlier, official, authoritative records, many of which were written by prophets who served the various kings of Israel. This evidence may fly in the face of what many Christians have been told, but we have explicit examples of this in both the Old and New Testaments. In the opening of the Gospel of Luke, for example, we read, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." Luke makes it clear that he is not an eyewitness, but he has carefully arranged his gospel from the actual eyewitness accounts, not just hearsay. Likewise with the historical books of the Old Testament, Judges through Esther. Even when a biblical writer is not the original eyewitness or participant in the events he records, he writes them from reliable information, not hearsay. So, with 2 or 3 exceptions, almost all of the 39 Old Testament books are directly connected with actual history one way or another. Taken together, these prophets, first-person books, and then the third-person histories lay out a basic historical framework for the entire Old Testament period. The biblical writers who used earlier accounts are not making things up or drawing on later legends that they're then projecting into the past, as the Bible's detractors want to make us believe. Even when they were not themselves eyewitnesses, they used authentic, accurate writings from the very times about which they were writing. This is very similar to a modern research paper that uses footnotes to carefully and honestly document its sources. But you might be thinking, weren't these writers biased? Well, of course they were biased. They believed in what they were reporting. But it's important to remember that it's nearly impossible to find an eyewitness to anything who isn't biased in some way. The issue is not whether the witness is biased, it's whether he or she is honest and accurate. Time after time over the centuries, we find that the individuals who distort the facts to support their agenda are not the people who wrote the Bible, but the people who attack it. So far we've looked at archaeology, the pros and cons, the format of ancient suzerainty treaties, inflation in the ancient world, and the use of personal official historical sources. Now let's turn our attention to the characters that appear on the pages of the Bible. The books that make up the Old Testament present major Jewish and non-Jewish characters as if they were real flesh and blood people, not myths and legends made up by later Jewish writers. So let's go name hunting outside the Bible. We'll ask questions like, do these characters actually exist? Are they verified outside of the scriptures? Are their times, places, and roles and circumstances correct? We'll start our name search with the beginning of the Jewish nation. The history of Israel begins about 1800 BC with a man named Abraham who left Mesopotamia and migrated to Palestine. Since Abraham and his immediate descendants were essentially wandering nomads, few kingdoms during their lifetime would be likely to notice them, much less mention them in their historical records. For that matter, the rulers in Palestine from this era have left little written records of any kind. It's only in later times, when descendants of the early biblical characters become the powerful, prosperous kingdoms of Israel and Judah, that we know the significance of these characters. The Bible itself confirms this. In the book of Psalms 105, when they were few in number, of little account and sojourners in the land, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account. In the book of Genesis, we read, Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. So we would not expect people of this stature and standing in the ancient world to be noticed. But we do know they had names that were commonly used in that era and in that part of the world. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as individuals go unmentioned by name in contemporary historical sources outside the Bible. Moving ahead in the narrative, because of a severe famine, Abraham's grandson Jacob and his 12 sons and their families migrate to Egypt, where they settle. The Bible tells us that even though the Egyptians forced them into slavery, their numbers increased tremendously over a period of about 430 years. That era ended when God delivered the 12 tribes of Israel from their Egyptian slavery through a series of plagues or catastrophic miracles that brought Egypt to its knees, culminating in the death of their firstborn children and the destruction of a major portion of the Egyptian army. The Israelites left Egypt and, due to their repeated rebellions against God, spent the next 40 years wandering around the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. The Yahweh inscription at the ancient city of Soleb may refer to this very period in Israel's history because it mentions the nomads of Yahweh. We might expect that there would be some mention of such monumental events like the Exodus, but not so. And there are at least 2 reasons for this. First, The pharaohs have left us thousands upon thousands of lines of inscriptions on temple walls and stone monuments, records of their power and exploits. But unlike other cultures in the ancient Near East, a universal characteristic of the pharaohs was that they never recorded anything that would be an embarrassment to their power. So the pharaoh who was reigning at the time of Israel's exodus from Egypt was not about to chisel a stone public record for everyone to learn about the escape of several million slaves, the 10 ruinous plagues, and the loss of his army at the Red Sea. There is substantial evidence that Israel's exodus from Egypt took place, and we'll look at it shortly. But regarding the biblical characters involved, none are mentioned by the Egyptians. That's reason number one. And second, we know that the Egyptians closely controlled the border into Palestine and no doubt would have kept records of such a significant border crossing. We learn from one Egyptian inscription that the Egyptians kept huge papyrus archives at the cities of Heliopolis and Pi-Ramses. But here's the catch. We also know, because of the very wet climate there, that not a single piece of those papyrus records have survived, including records of the Israelites leaving Egypt. All of the evidence is gone. So the Israelites settle in the land of Canaan, where they struggled to displace its prior inhabitants. But for another 350 years, they're little more than a loose confederation of tribes, descended from a common ancestor and with a common god. Unlike the Egyptian superpower with its massive temples and monuments and thousands of inscriptions, the tiny kingdoms in Canaan, with their meager resources, did not leave behind independent records that mention specific characters in Israel's history. Once again, we come up dry when we're looking for specific names. But this does not mean that these characters didn't exist. It just means that there was not a reason for the extra-biblical sources to mention them. And then, around 1000 BC, things changed dramatically. The surrounding kingdoms have advanced and prospered, and the Israelites want to keep pace by setting up a king of their own. King Saul is the first king, followed by David and then his son Solomon. The nation soon splits into northern and southern kingdoms, and the Old Testament's 9 historical books and the individual prophets describe these kingdoms over the span of about 500 years. Let's zoom in on that period. First, we'll look from the inside out. We'll consult the ancient non-biblical records to see if they confirm or conflict with the Bible's details. Lawrence Mitchell has collected a couple of thoroughly documented lists in several of his articles that have been published in Biblical Archaeology Review. So that there would be no question of the accuracy and authenticity of the sources, Mitchell deliberately limited his list to ancient records that were written within 50 years or less of the lifetime of each of the characters who's mentioned. We'll begin with the non-Jewish characters from the surrounding nations who make their appearance in the Old Testament. From Egypt, the Bible names these 5 pharaohs. Existing Egyptian inscriptions have confirmed all 5. From Moab, the famous Mesha stela we'll look at later has confirmed King Mesha. From Aram Damascus, 5 kings. From the Assyrian Empire, 5 kings and 1 royal assassin. From Babylonia, 3 kings, 3 court officials, and 1 co-regent. From Persia, 5 kings and 1 provincial governor. All 30 of these people are mentioned in the Bible, and all 30 have been confirmed in the ancient sources outside the Bible, and they're in the right place, the right time, and they have the right function and title. So far, so good. But what about the other way around? If the 2 kingdoms of Israel really existed, wouldn't they be noticed by the surrounding nations? In fact, they were. Among the Bible's Jewish characters from the northern Jewish kingdom, we have 8 kings and 1 governor who have been confirmed from sources outside the Bible. From the southern Jewish kingdom of Judah, we have 6 kings, 2 high priests, 1 scribe, 3 royal officials for 3 different kings, the fathers of 2 royal officials. These characters are mentioned outside of the Bible on ancient temple walls, stone prisms, victory stelae, bullae, seals, and so forth. And because they were written on non-perishable materials, these writings are not copies. They are the originals. And keep in mind that this is just the evidence that's surfaced so far. When we assemble all of this information from outside the Bible, it solidly confirms the actual reality of 30 secular characters mentioned in the Old Testament and 23 of its Jewish characters mentioned outside the Bible. These people lived over a period of more than 500 years in a variety of places, times, and situations in the ancient Near East. There are, of course, one or two individuals that are still debated, but 130 years of archaeological and inscriptional research haven't turned up a single piece of evidence that flat out contradicts the Bible's accounts of the various historical characters that appear on its pages. Think about that. The average person today, even with the vast amount of information electronically available, would find it hard to report their own country's recent past and get such details straight. Yet the Bible's detractors want us to believe that later Jewish writers, 500 or 600 years after the fact, simply wrote a fictitious history for Israel and got all this information perfect. So how could the biblical writers accomplish such a task? Simple. They weren't making things up. Some were actual eyewitnesses, others accurately used original historical records, and when we add to this the skill and integrity of the writers, their remarkable accuracy makes perfect sense. So where are we? Remember when we looked at the biblical timeline? The critics said the Bible's not anyone's history. The nation of Israel was made up in the 3rd to 2nd century BC. Kings like Saul and David and Solomon are just folklores like King Arthur. Well, the detailed historical accuracy of the Old Testament demolishes this claim. The 2nd and 3rd century Jews simply had no access to the necessary information. It lay buried under centuries of rubble and debris. You may be asking yourself, but couldn't the later Jews have dug up ancient records just like we have in order to get the details for writing their fictional accounts of their national origins? There are obvious reasons why the ancient people didn't do this. When we looked at how the ancient cities formed tells through layer after layer of occupation, we pointed out that once a new city was built and occupied, the opportunity to go searching through the earlier ruins was simply unavailable because people were living there again. And later, when a site was finally abandoned for the last time, the uppermost layer was soon covered with wind-blown soil and lay untouched for more than 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the succeeding generations of nearby inhabitants forgot the name of the city and in most cases that there even had been a city there. Even as late as the 1800s, most scholars assumed that the flat-top mounds that dot the landscape in Israel were natural formations like the buttes in the American Southwest. And it wasn't until 1890, that Sir William Flinders Petrie first dug into Tel El-Hesi and demonstrated that the flat-top mounds were actually the man-made layered ruins of ancient cities. There are some signs of looting by ancient treasure hunters, but the tells show no sign of ancient excavations like archaeologists do today. So later Jews living in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC couldn't be the actual writers of the Old Testament because they had no access to the factual information that is so pervasive and foundational to the Old Testament documents. These writings were not made up by later Jews. They were written by people living at the time or by ancient Jewish writers who used recent official records from close to their own era. They wrote about Israelite history with fidelity and accuracy because they weren't writing books of folklore and legend. These men were writing about events that actually occurred, people who actually lived, and places that actually existed. But there's something more. These writers were not just historians who got it right. There is also a message and interpretation interwoven in what they wrote. They tell us that God had a role in these events and that he interacted with the people in these accounts. And their honesty and accuracy and credibility demand that we give that message a fair hearing. From the evidence that we've looked at so far, it begins to look like the Bible's detractors make their assertions in spite of the facts. One possible explanation for this is the message of the Bible itself. People often attack things that threaten their values and their own view of reality. But the tragedy is that these are the very folks who are behind the widespread and widely accepted idea that the Bible can't be trusted. As we're beginning to see, the facts tell us the opposite. Now let's pick up a topic that we mentioned earlier, the exodus of Israel from Egypt and their conquest of the land of Canaan. As we noted, the Egyptians don't report the biblical event of the Exodus or its characters, but they do provide important corroboration nonetheless. Here again, we're indebted to Kenneth Kitchen for gathering a great deal of data. We'll start with the city of Hebron. The city of Hebron, which still exists today, is mentioned by Moses in the book of Numbers about 1400 BC, and then by Joshua about 1350 BC, and then in the book of Judges about 1300 to 1200. The Bible's detractors are quick to run to the archaeologists who claim that Hebron was not even a city at this time. They assert that because they have not yet turned up any physical archaeological evidence for the city of Hebron from that era, that it must not have existed. In fact, one Bible detractor confidently asserts it is quite clear that the biblical writers knew nothing about events in Palestine before the 10th century BCE. But this assertion ignores some critical data from ancient Egypt. Let's zoom in for a closer look at ancient Hebron. Fortunately, we're not limited by the physical archaeological evidence that's been discovered and interpreted so far, because we have the personal records of independent witnesses from that very era. Pharaoh Ramses II chiseled his long list of cities in ancient Palestine into the wall of the magnificent temple complex at Medinet Habu. Cities 77 through 80 include Hebron and several of the nearby towns, Janam, Durban, and Afaka. Further, there's another list of cities that gives Hebron as the principal city on the western route out of Egypt, Yahu-Helbab, Athar, Hebron. So not only do the pharaohs mention Hebron as a recognized city in the right era, but the list of Ramses II is an almost perfect match with the one in the Bible given by Joshua. So which do we trust? The theories of the archaeologists reasoning from limited, incomplete evidence that they've been able to turn up 3,500 years after the fact, or the account of a contemporary pharaoh who had actually dispatched his forces to those very cities? But let's move on from Hebron and broaden our investigation. We'll take a look at the actual route that the Israelites took on their exodus out of Egypt. In the book of Numbers, Moses gives us a list of the various places where Israel had camped during their 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness. Then he gives us a list of cities where they camped as they headed north from Sinai into Palestine, the land of Canaan. One reason that biblical detractors reject the authenticity of Moses' account is that his list includes the city of Dibon, an important site of worship in the later centuries. The problem is that archaeologists have found no ruins at Dibon prior to the 9th century BC, 200 or 300 years too late for Moses to be correct. But lack of evidence is not itself evidence. So what do the Egyptian pharaohs have to say about Dibon? It turns out that the pharaohs controlled Palestine from 1560 to 1200 BC, and, of course, they mapped this region. While we don't have their maps themselves, we do have their lists of the cities along the routes that they used over the span of 300 years as they traveled in and out of Palestine. These lists are preserved on the various inscriptions at the temples of Amnon at Karnak, Saleb in Egypt today, and the giant temple complex at Medinet Habu. There are 3 pharaohs from this era whose cities lists have been identified: Thutmose III, Amenephis III, and Ramses II. All 3 of these pharaohs list Dibon. Here's the list from the pharaohs of that era. And now, here's the list from Moses from the book of Numbers. Why would the pharaohs consistently list a city on one of their main military routes into the territory that they controlled if they didn't even exist yet? It's striking how closely the list in the Bible corresponds to the list used by the pharaohs. But it's also worth noting that the 2 lists differ enough to make it clear that these lists were created independently from each other. Now let's follow this line of evidence a couple of steps further. First, we have the famous Merneptah stela, discovered in Thebes in 1896 by Sir Flinders Petrie, and now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. On his stela, Pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203, mentions Israel by name. He claims a crushing military victory over them in his campaign into Canaan or Palestine, saying, "The Canaan has been plundered on every sort of woe, Ascalon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste and his seed is not, Huru has become a widow because of Egypt." Some archaeologists try to dodge this evidence by insisting that the word Israel here must refer to some kind of proto-Israel instead of the people portrayed in the Bible. But this assertion doesn't stand up against the facts. Unlike Assyrian and Mesopotamian kings, the pharaohs were known for exalting their military conquests. So a pharaoh is not going to report a minor, insignificant military accomplishment. That would be like the powerful head of a drug cartel boasting that he robbed a convenience store. Nope. Whatever its level of organization may have been, Israel was a known, identifiable national entity, and it was worthy of the pharaoh boasting that he had attacked and defeated them. Merneptah's report proves that Israel was in the land of Canaan and worthy of his military action as early as 1213 to 1203 BC. But let's get one last piece of the puzzle, the population explosion. We know from the dating of the myriad of small villages that have been identified in that part of Palestine that the population of the land was doubling about every 100 years. But then all of a sudden, in exactly the period when the Bible says that Israel had entered and occupied the land, the number of cities increased by a factor of 5. Obviously, you can't all of a sudden produce children 5 times faster. There must have been an influx of people during that period. When we cross off the other various people groups who simply couldn't qualify in that era, we're pretty much left with the people that Pharaoh Merneptah called Israel, a definite corroboration of the Bible's account of the books of Joshua and Judges. So a complete picture emerges. A people group entered Palestine and caused a big jump in population. On their way in, they stopped at cities known to us from 3 different pharaohs who reigned over the span of 300 years. Pharaoh Merneptah feels the need to take military action against them and then boasts of his victory. He identifies this people group as Israel, just as the Bible does. So which do we trust? The theories of skeptical archaeologists 3,500 years after the fact, reasoning from the lack of data, or the consistent witness of the pharaohs who controlled these very cities, living at exactly that time, and who felt the need to respond with military force to a people in Palestine whom they called Israel. In the first half of this session, we've looked at a variety of evidence that supports the accuracy and credibility of the Old Testament. We looked at archaeology and tells, ancient treaties, the inflation of slave prices in the ancient Near East, the goals and methods for the writing of biblical history, the match of characters between the Bible and the ancient foreign writings, the plausibility of the Exodus, the city of Hebron, the records of the pharaohs, the path of the Exodus, and the population explosion at the time of the Exodus. In the second half of this session, we'll look at even more striking examples of the historical reliability of the Old Testament as we ask and answer the question, how did we get the Bible?